Welcome to the ninth presentation in the sixth webinar series presented by the International Adsorption Society. The IAS is an international organization dedicated to advancing adsorption as a solution to scientific, engineering, and human welfare challenges through the promotion of adsorption research and education. We thank everyone for attending the webinar today. The webinar series has been an immense success, and the recordings of previous webinars continue to be viewed on YouTube and Bilibili. This is the ninth webinar in our sixth series, which we will continue to have monthly throughout the year. We intend to continue with a variety of speakers from industry, academia, and other research institutes, as well as PhD students and early career researchers. Announcements regarding the sixth series will be distributed through the IAS mailing list, Twitter feed, and LinkedIn page. Today's webinar will be given by Dr. Randall Snurr at Northwestern University in the United States. It is also part of our special IAS webinar series titled Diffusion in Nanoporous Materials, Guidelines for Measurement and Reporting, focusing on the recent IUPAC technical report, Diffusion in Nanoporous Materials, the special consideration of the measurement of determining parameters. I am Nicholas Wilkins at Svante Technologies Incorporated in Canada. Today's webinar will be moderated by Nicole Ferrou at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. We are required to remind attendees and future viewers that the views expressed by the speaker, host, or other moderators are not necessarily those of the IAS or the institutions associated with those individuals. We ask that you consider joining the IAS as a regular member if you are not already. Our dues are minimal, only $20 US per year, but support the publication of our flagship journal, Adsorption, contribute to travel grants, and workshop seed funding for IAS members and affiliated groups, as well as aid the organization of our triennial conference on the fundamentals of adsorption. Members also receive free access to IAS-supported materials, including our journal, as well as the adsorption database published by Springer Materials. Anyone can follow the IAS on our social media pages for future updates regarding IAS events, webinars, and information about scientific meetings. We are most active on our IAS LinkedIn group, which can be found by searching the International Adsorption Society in the search bar. Please help us expand our YouTube channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. I'll now hand it over to Nicole Ferrou, who will moderate the YouTube Q&A.
It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Randy Snurr to today's webinar session. Dr. Randy Snurr is the John G. Searle Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering at Northwestern University. He holds a BSc degree in Chemical Engineering from the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD in Chemical Engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include development of new nanoporous materials for energy and sustainability applications, molecular simulation, diffusion in nanoporous materials, adsorption separations, and catalysis. He is a corresponding member of the Saxon Academy of Sciences and received the Institute Award for Excellence in Industrial Gases Technology from IUPAC. During the webinar, questions can be submitted to the speaker as comments on the YouTube live stream, and we will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. With that, I welcome Dr. Randy Snurr again and pass over the presentation to him.
Thank you, Nicole, for the nice introduction. I will share my screen here. Okay, do you see the slides in the correct version, the correct mode?
We do, Randy.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about molecular simulation of diffusion in nanoporous materials. I'll cover some basics, talk about best practices and comparisons with experiment. And as Nicholas said, this webinar is related to the recent release of an IUPAC report related to measuring diffusion in nanoporous materials. And that work was led by Professor Jörg Carragher. And as they were working on this, Jörg thought it might actually be a nice idea to have a section in this report on modeling and how modeling has interacted with experimental measurements of diffusion in nanoporous materials. So Marc-Olivier Coppens, Peter Ravicovich, Herman Sastre, and myself wrote the modeling section of this report. And so this report appeared recently in the journal Pure and Applied Chemistry. Along with the report, there's a 2-volume collection of papers on diffusion in nanoporous materials that appeared in the Adsorption Journal in 2021. Shown here is the editorial for that collection of papers. And one of the papers was on modeling. And so this was led by Brandon Bukowski. He was a postdoc in my group at the time. Fred Kyle was associated with this, and then the same authors that I mentioned earlier. It's quite long. It's 78 pages. And of course, I will not cover the whole thing today, but I referred you to this if you'd like more details. So what I plan to do is provide a brief introduction to methods for molecular simulation of diffusion in nanoporous crystalline materials. So the review article we wrote also includes a section on amorphous materials, especially mesoporous materials. That was mostly written by Marc-Olivier Coppens. But I'm going to focus on crystalline materials. So I'll talk briefly about force field models and then molecular dynamics, or MD simulations. After that introduction, then I'll discuss best practices for performing and reporting MD simulations. This was one of the things we covered in the IUPAC report. And then I'll end with a few examples related to diffusion in metal organic frameworks. Okay, so if we want to model diffusion in, say, a MOF. Maybe we're interested in this MOF NU1000. We'd like to be able to predict diffusion coefficients, understand how molecules move, follow their trajectories. How do we do this? So we need a model to start. And so I'll describe that briefly. So here we're talking about models based on classical mechanics, so not quantum mechanics. These are often referred to as force field models, sometimes called molecular mechanics. And the idea is that we will write the total energy of the system as a sum of different contributions. So things like bond stretching, bond angle bending, torsional rotations, and then non-bonded interactions. And so it's a simple idea. We'll write the total energy is by just summing up all of these contributions. And this force field then has to specify both the functional form and the parameters for the equations to get all of these different energy contributions. So an example is shown here. This is the so-called Dryden force field. It's a fairly generic force field. And you can see we write the total energy as the sum of these contributions that we mentioned before. So for example, bond stretching, there's some equilibrium bond length, R naught, but if you make the bond longer or shorter, the energy goes up, and we'll just model that with a simple harmonic term. Similarly, for bond angle bending, torsions are often written as a cosine expansion of the dihedral angles. And then for non-bonded interactions, so for example, if you just had two argon atoms, they attract each other at certain distances, it's very common to use the Leonard-Jones equation. So we could put a Leonard-Jones site on every atom in the system. And similarly, we might put partial charges on the atoms and calculate their energies as just a simple Coulombic contribution. So where do you get the parameters? Often there are established force fields, and different force fields have different targets. So, for example, if you're modeling something like proteins, there are force fields that are developed just for that. For nanoporous materials, people often use the trap force field for the guest-guest interactions, and then something like Dryden or UFF for the framework contributions. And there are some more specific force fields like UFF for MOF, and there are specific force fields that have been developed for some zeolites. So each of these force fields contains, all the parameters from those expressions on the previous slide. If you're using commercial software, they're often part of the software package. But you should be aware that the results of your MD simulation are sensitive to the force field, especially to the torsion and the non-bonded parameters. And the force field should really be viewed as a single entity. If you change one parameter, it affects the others. So one option is use established force fields. Another option is to fit your own. And I don't have time to cover that today, obviously, but I would say, keep in mind this last point if you do that. Okay, so we have this model now. What are we going to do with it? We're not going to model, say, a whole zeolite crystal, like a micron-sized crystal. That's too many atoms. Typical MD simulations might be a few thousand atoms. You could simulate up to 1,000,000, but that's much less than macroscopic numbers. And the limitations are due to memory storage requirements and computer speed. We will see that the energy calculations that we need scale as the square of the number of atoms in the system. So, we have some atoms here we want to simulate. The typical thing to do is to use periodic boundary conditions. So we surround the box of atoms that we're going to simulate, say a couple of unit cells of a zeolite. We surround it with images of itself. And so if a particle leaves one side of the main box, its image comes back in the other side. Here's just a short example. So say we wanted to simulate CO2 in a MOF. One option might be fix the MOF atoms at their crystallographic coordinates, put a Lennard-Jones site on each of those MOF atoms with the Dryden force field, put partial charges on these framework atoms. You can get those from quantum mechanical calculations. And then for the CO2, you might take the CO2 parameters from the trap force field, which has been developed to match the bulk vapor-liquid equilibria. And it's a simple Lennard-Jones plus Coulomb potential. So with a model like that, you could predict, say, the adsorption isotherms. And this would be done with Monte Carlo, which is not something we'll cover today, but I just thought I'd show this. So a simple model like that can capture these pretty complicated adsorption isotherms at different temperatures in nice agreement with experiment. So, okay, let's turn to diffusion now. So we have the model. And one of the ways to predict diffusion is to do a molecular dynamics simulation or an MD simulation. And conceptually, it's straightforward. You integrate Newton's equations numerically. So F equals ma, and we'll follow the particle trajectories and calculate things we're interested in. So imagine a system of particles. So for each particle I, the force tells you the acceleration. And we can get the forces as the negative gradient of the potential energy. And the potential energy is from the force field that we described earlier. So the idea is that at each instant of time, you can calculate the energies and you can get the forces, and that tells you the acceleration. It tells you how to move the atoms. And so you march along in finite time steps, little delta t. So for example, the velocity Verlet algorithm would be one numerical method for solving these equations. And so here are the equations from the velocity Verlet algorithm. So what's this telling us? If we know the position of all the atoms at time t, and we know their velocities, and we know the accelerations from the forces, We can get the positions at time t plus delta t. We can also get the velocities at the new time step. And then once we have the new positions, we can get the new forces and the acceleration for the term here. And so we just march forward in time doing this over and over for hundreds of thousands or millions of time steps. And so the particles basically move. You get a little movie of the particles moving around. And since this is on Zoom, I didn't think a movie might work very well. So I don't have a movie to show you, but there are plenty of them online that you can check out. So once you've done this, one of the things you could easily calculate would be the self-diffusivity. So the self-diffusivity is basically defined by this so-called Einstein equation. If we have the positions of all the particles as a function of time, we can calculate the quantity here. We know the position of particle L at time 0, and we know its position at some time t later. We can square that displacement, and then these brackets here indicate to take on an ensemble average. So we'll average over many particles. And at long times, this so-called mean squared displacement is proportional to the time. So you get a linear regime out here, and the slope is related to the self-diffusion coefficient. So, and I should point out, this is for a system at equilibrium. So there are no gradients. We're just tracking the particle's motion as a function of time, and that gives us what's called the self-diffusivity. And so from MD, we have all of these positions, and so we can calculate this quite readily. For example, here are results for linear alkanes from MD in blue and from NMR in red. And these are shown at a constant loading of molecules in the EarMOF1 as a function of chain length from methane up to C16. And you can see there's really nice agreement here between the MD predictions and the NMR measurements. And this is using one of these simple models that I described earlier. Results are also shown here for benzene. And you can see the diffusivities vary over about 2 orders of magnitude, and the MD is able to reproduce this quite well. What else might we learn from this? If we add a little more data here, the purple points are the diffusivities of these same molecules in a sodium X zeolite. So we can see the diffusivities are faster in this EarMOF1. And in green, these are the diffusivities of the bulk liquids. And so what we see here is that the diffusivities of these molecules at this loading in this MOF are pretty similar to the liquid diffusivities. They're higher than what you have in the zeolite, and that's maybe expected since the MOF it's a more open structure. So these are liquid-like diffusivities. One of the choices you have to make in running an MD simulation is the time step. So that little delta t. And the time step is dictated by the fastest motions of the system. You need a time step that's small enough to capture those. On the other hand, you'd like to choose delta t as big as possible so that you can simulate a longer time. But this first bullet is really, what you need to do. You need to pick it so you can model the fastest motions of the system. So here are typical values of the time steps in an MD simulation. If you're just simulating something like argon or xenon, you can use a time step of about 10 to the minus 14 seconds. If you have flexible bonds, you need a shorter time step to capture those bond stretches. But in general, these time steps are on the order of 10 to the minus 15, 10 to the minus 15 seconds, or 1 femtosecond. What else can we calculate? The MD simulations, as I've described them, sample the NVE ensemble from statistical mechanics. In other words, we have fixed number of particles, fixed volume, and the Newton's equations conserve energy. So the energy is fixed. But you might want to know the temperature. So we can get the temperature as shown here. We can define an instantaneous temperature related to the kinetic energy. So the kinetic energy of the system is just 1/2 mv squared for all of the particles, or it's written here in terms of the momenta. And from the equipartition theorem of statistical mechanics, there's 1/2 kT of thermal energy per degree of freedom. So if we have n particles, we'd have 3n degrees of freedom, but we might have some constraints. For example, we might fix the bond lengths in our MD simulation. So we can get the kinetic energy, we can use this expression to define an instantaneous temperature, and if we average that, that gives us the actual temperature of the simulation. Typically, though, you want to specify the temperature. And so it's possible to run a simulation with a fixed temperature instead of fixed energy. The so-called thermostat methods allow you to do an MD simulation in the NVT ensemble. And that's covered in standard textbooks on molecular simulation, so I won't cover that today. You can also calculate structural properties. I mean, you know where all of the atoms are in the system. So for example, you could just put little dots where the particles are during the simulation, and you might see, oh, these molecules really like the corners of this particular MOF here. You could calculate the pair distribution function, which is familiar from theories of the liquid state. You could calculate other structural properties that you might be interested in. But let's talk a little bit more about transport properties. So I already described how we can get the self-diffusion coefficient from this Einstein equation. We can plot the mean squared displacement versus time, and at long times, this linear region gives you the self-diffusivity. Turns out there's another way you can do this. Instead of this so-called Einstein form, you can use what's called the Green-Kubo form. So now we look at the velocities of particles. So this is the velocity of particle I at time 0, and its velocity at some later time t. And these velocities are vectors. So we can take a dot product. We can take the ensemble average of that. And then we can integrate that from 0 to infinity, divide by 3, and we get the self-diffusivity. And this is entirely equivalent to what we had on the previous slide with this mean squared displacement. So this quantity inside the brackets here is referred to as the velocity autocorrelation function. And for a liquid, this velocity autocorrelation function often looks something like shown here. So at short times, this velocity is highly correlated with the initial velocity, and so you have some high value. At very long times, these are completely uncorrelated, and so this decays to 0, often with these oscillations. And so if you make this plot and do the integration, you can get the self-diffusivity. One thing to note is that this long time tail here, even though it looks sort of small, it can be significant. And so you do need to integrate this out to fairly long times. So the self-diffusivity is for a system at equilibrium. It's just tracking the displacements of the particles. Often we're interested in systems with a concentration gradient. So we want the Fickian diffusivity. And so I'll describe that briefly here just for a binary system. So in a very general form, we could write that the flux of component I is related to the concentration gradient of component I with some diffusivity here, but it's also related to the concentration gradient of the other component, J, with a so-called cross term. Similarly, we could write the flux of component J. You can also write this in terms of chemical potential gradients. And now these coefficients are referred to as phenomenological coefficients, or sometimes Onsager coefficients, and they're usually given the symbol L. You can relate these two if you rewrite chemical potentials in terms of fugacities and the concentration. And the concentration here means the concentration inside the zeolite or the MOF. You get these expressions that relate the D's, so dii and dij, it relates them to these L's. And these other terms here you can get from the adsorption isotherm. Think of F as basically the partial pressure, C is the concentration inside the MOF or the zeolite. So this is related to the adsorption isotherm. So then the next question is, well, how do we get these L coefficients? And you can get these from what's known as linear response theory. The idea is for a system at equilibrium, there will be spontaneous fluctuations. Imagine the density at one spot is a little higher in one spot and a little lower somewhere else. That density gradient will relax over time. And linear response theory says the way that spontaneous fluctuation dies out is related to how imposed gradients relax. And so with that idea, people have derived expressions for these phenomenological coefficients. And it looks familiar. I mean, this looks like a green Kubo expression, but now these are not the velocities of individual molecules. Instead, this is the so-called streaming velocity. So this is the subscript I here is a component now. So for component I, you add up the velocities of all of the particles of component I, add up these vectors, and get this little j here. And you do that at time 0, and then you can do it at later times. So from these streaming velocities, you can again get this autocorrelation function, take the average of that, integrate it, and that gives you these phenomenological coefficients. Now, if these were velocities of individual components, or sorry, individual molecules, you can average over all the molecules. So a single MD simulation with n particles gives you n contributions to the average. But now, a single MD simulation only gives you one contribution to the average because you can't do this for individual particles. It's just for the whole system. As a consequence, these calculations are much more time-consuming than calculating the self-diffusivity, and typically you end up averaging over multiple simulations to get reasonable averages. But this is doable. And so, yeah, there are papers in the literature, including from my group, where we've done this. I'll just briefly mention you can also do non-equilibrium MD. And this was done by Ed McGinn. We were lab mates when I was a PhD student, and he set up a system where he had a high concentration in several unit cells, and then a low concentration in several more unit cells, and then he has periodic boundary conditions. And so he set this up at time t equals 0, and then ran an MD simulation. And of course, this sharp concentration gradient will relax over time. And so you can follow that concentration profile, fit it to Fick's law, and back out a diffusion coefficient. And there are other ways of doing non-equilibrium MD. Okay, so a quick recap. We've covered a lot. So the basic idea of an MD simulation is to integrate Newton's equations of motion numerically. If we do that, we can calculate thermodynamic properties, transport properties, structural properties. We pointed out that you can do MD in ensembles other than the NVE ensemble. In particular, you can fix the temperature instead of the energy. We talked about getting different transport properties, especially the self-diffusivity and the Fickian diffusivity. And I also pointed out that you can do non-equilibrium MD. So in the IUPAC report, one of the reasons to include a section on modeling was that modeling can help interpret experiments. And I'll talk about just briefly one example here. So in the late 1970s, people had been measuring diffusion in zeolites by uptake measurements, where you measure the the uptake as a function of time, fit that to Fick's law, back out a diffusion coefficient. But people had also started doing pulse field gradient NMR. And what they found was that the diffusivities varied by initially about 5 orders of magnitude. And so Jörg Kerger was leading the PFG NMR work. Doug Ruthven was one of the leading groups doing the uptake measurements. And they started working together to solve this puzzle. They discovered, for example, in some of the uptake measurements, it turned out, oh, temperature effects were important. So they corrected for that. They realized, oh, we're using different zeolite samples. So they started using the same zeolite samples. And so they were able to take this difference of about 5 orders of magnitude, and it kept getting smaller and smaller, but there were still differences. And so they published 2 papers on this in the 80s. And then in the early 90s, the first MD simulations of diffusion in zeolites started appearing. And I showed this very well-known example from Larry June, Alex Bell, and Doros Theodoro. They did MD simulations for methane and silicalite. And you can see that their results at 200 Kelvin and 300 Kelvin agree really well with PFG NMR data from the literature. And so this provided some additional useful information that the PFG NMR results seem to be very reliable. It didn't explain all of these differences though. And so people continued to work on this, and I won't go into all of that, but I thought I'd point out, especially for students watching this, the importance of being open-minded in research. You could imagine that Jörg Kerger and Doug Ruthven getting very different results. You could imagine they could have become bitter enemies, but they didn't. They said, oh, these differences are telling us something interesting. We should work together and figure this out. They wrote those papers I had on the earlier slide. They ended up writing a book together, the original version here and a later version also with Doros Theodoro. And they became great friends from doing this and pushed the science forward. So I think this is a really nice example for all of us, the real role models for those of us working in science. Okay, let me turn to best practices. So this was one of the things we wanted to put in the IUPAC report. So first, best practices for performing MD simulations. So there are a number of open source MD codes available. So you can do MD without writing your own code, but it's important that you understand what the code is doing. And as the user of one of these codes, you have to make some choices. For example, one of the biggest choices you have to make is the model or the force field. The force field plays a critical role in determining the quality of the results you're getting. So for some systems, well-established force fields exist. For example, if you're simulating alkanes in MFI zeolite, there are good force fields. You can use them. If you're tackling some new system, ideally you want to test the model against experiment. And what's very common is to start by testing the model against thermodynamic properties, especially absorption isotherms, because the experimental data are just more plentiful than for diffusion coefficients. So this is often a good starting point, but it may not be enough. And you would really like to have at least a little bit of experimental data to validate your model. Maybe not for the exact system you're working on, but even a related system would help give you confidence that your model is good. And a big choice is whether to treat the framework as rigid or flexible. And yeah, for lack of time, I won't talk about that, but obviously that's an important choice. Another question is, well, how long should you simulate? And a common thing to do is to plot some quantity you're interested in versus, over the course of the simulation and check. There might be some equilibration period, but then eventually it should level off and fluctuate around some constant value. And I'm sorry, my example here is from a Monte Carlo simulation, but it would be the same thing in an MD simulation. And it will continue to fluctuate. Those fluctuations are real. They're from expected from statistical mechanics. But you can see here it's not drifting up or down, and so you would not use this initial portion to calculate the things you're interested in, but you would do your averages over the so-called production phase of the simulation. Kind of related question. This Einstein form says to take the limit as t goes to infinity. So in the diffusive regime, the mean square displacement is proportional to time. And so you can plot that on a linear scale, but even better is to plot this on a log-log plot. And so this linear diffusive regime will have a slope of 1 on a log-log plot. So you can look for you should look for that. It's also recommended that you take the square root of the mean squared displacement and check that that's at least 1 unit cell in length. In other words, that your particles are moving at least 1 unit cell. They're actually exploring the entire structure. And you really want to check, are the molecules actually moving? Are they diffusing on the time scale of the simulation? Or are they just vibrating around their initial positions? If they're just vibrating around their initial positions, they're not really diffusing. And so even if this looks linear, you can't extract a meaningful diffusion coefficient. Ernesto Vargas, a postdoc in my group, automated a way to do this. So these curves have these different regimes. There's initially a so-called ballistic regime. The particles are just moving. They're not running into anything. Just like a particle moving in free space. So you get a certain regime here at very short times. In porous materials, it's very common to have this subdiffusive regime where the slope is less than 1. That's sort of like bouncing around in a cage. But then eventually you break out of the cage and diffuse to multiple cages, and that's your diffusive regime. And so Ernesto automated a way to fit these regions and extract a diffusion coefficient. And so I encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested. So those were best practices for performing MD simulations. How about best practices for reporting them? So when you go to write up a paper, as in all publications, the goal should be to provide enough detail that someone could reproduce the work. So at a minimum, authors should report the full details of the force field. Please tabulate the parameters. It's very frustrating to read a paper where they say, we took the parameters from this other paper. And you go to that paper and they say, well, we took them from an earlier paper. And you go to that paper and, oh, like 2 of the parameters are missing, or there's an obvious typo. And then you don't know what these later papers did. So yeah, people should tabulate the parameters. Include the cutoff distance for the Leonard-Jones interactions. Those are usually cut off at some distance and neglected beyond that, or people use tail corrections. These are very common things that people don't include, including our group in some of our older papers, but they do make a difference. You should report the MD code that you used, and several common ones are listed here. What algorithm did you use to integrate the equations of motion? So for example, the velocity Verlet algorithm, the time step, how long were the simulations? How did you determine they were equilibrated? And if you used a thermostat or a barostat, you should describe which one and any associated parameters. But nowadays, there's no limit on how big the supporting information can be in papers. So better yet, include some of your sample input and output files that have all of that information. Even better, include all of your input files and some sample output files, either in the SI, or if it's too big, you can put these in an online repository. That really then ensures that people can reproduce your results. Okay, so in the remaining maybe 5 or 10 minutes, I'll talk about an example of doing MD simulations in MOFs. And this is work from Brandon Bukowski. So first, just a preliminary comment here. A lot of what we know about diffusion in MOFs is actually from molecular simulation. The first MD simulations of diffusion in MOFs appeared 2 years before the first experiments. And this is now about 20 years ago. Okay, so yeah, let me talk about this work from Brandon. So we were interested in MOFs with zirconium nodes because other people, including some of our collaborators, had found that these MOFs were really active catalysts for hydrolysis of organophosphates. And organophosphates are um, typical pesticides or various toxic agents, including chemical warfare agents, are often organophosphates. And so these zirconium MOFs can break down these molecules into less harmful molecules. And so it's important to know the rate of diffusion of molecules into the MOF and the products back out. So these zirconium MOFs can be made with a variety of linkers, so-called ditopic linkers that connect to two nodes. So this linker would connect to the node through these carboxylates. So this has two carboxylates at the end, so this would be ditopic. But you could have a linker with four carboxylates in a so-called tetratopic linker, tritopic linker, and so on. And the zirconium nodes can also have different connectivities. So this node connects to 12 linkers, this one connects to 8, this one connects to 6. And so you can make a large variety of different MOFs with these zirconium nodes. And we became interested in the question of whether the MOF topology plays a role in controlling the diffusion of these toxic agents. So Brandon, on the computer, generated 38 zirconium MOFs with 19 different topologies using very similar organic linkers in these different MOFs. So yeah, different topologies, but same or similar linkers. And he ran MD simulations. Some of the details are shown down here, and he used this automated method developed earlier by Ernesto Vargas for extracting the diffusion coefficients from the mean squared displacement plots. And this automated workflow was really nice for doing a large number of simulations, so we could do high throughput computations. So we started with something simple. We did propane first. And so we have the diffusivities of propane in 38 different MOFs at a variety of different loadings, from quite empty up to nearly full. And one of the things we found was that the self-diffusion coefficients vary pretty linearly with the energy of absorption, the heat of absorption, it's often referred to. But that's not an easily measured or calculated quantity. So we were looking for simpler things, and the simplest thing you might think of is the so-called pore limiting diameter, basically the window size. You might expect a smaller window, the diffusion would be slower, a bigger window would be faster. But you can see from this plot, there's no correlation at all. And for example, if you look at these two MOFs that are highlighted, they have about the same pore limiting diameter, but the diffusivities vary by an order of magnitude. So we thought, well, maybe the connectivity of the nodes plays a role. So we looked at that. So we averaged over the different MOFs. And so if you plot the average propane diffusivity in the 12 connected MOFs, you get these values, 8 connected and 6 connected. And what you can see is that the MOFs with higher node connectivity, on average, have smaller propane diffusivities. On the other hand, the linker connectivity, whether it's ditopic or tetratopic, really plays no role. So, okay, so we've learned something. The node connectivity seems to play an important role. We moved on then and looked at one of these organophosphates. So this is DMMP. Here's the structure. It has a kinetic diameter of about 6 angstroms. And we ramped up here. So now we did 776 MOFs with 268 topologies. And again, there's really no correlation between the self-diffusivity and the pore limiting diameter. So we wanted to see if we could come up with some set of descriptors that would correlate with the self-diffusivity and would be able to predict this quantity and maybe give us some insight. So we developed a machine learning model, and I'm not going to describe this in detail, but we had two objectives. One was something that would be predictive, but also something that would give us some insight. So for machine learning, you need descriptors, something that tells the model about how one MOF is different from another. So we used the node connectivity and the linker connectivity that I already discussed, but we also dreamed up some new descriptors. For example, the length along the linker, the length from one node, this carboxylate along here, and then over here to the next node at this carboxylate. So you could calculate that. We use some of the really common so-called textural properties, like the largest cavity diameter, the pore limiting diameter, different surface areas. And then we kind of dreamed up, thought up some descriptors related to the nodes. So for example, we have one here called the node volume fraction. Imagine you have a volume of MOF and you ask what fraction of that volume is occupied by nodes? Or what's the minimum distance between two nodes? And we have several others. And there's another one that I'm not going to describe. And so we developed, or Brandon developed, a machine learning model. Here are some of the details with these 18 descriptors. And it does a pretty good job of predicting the self-diffusivity compared to what we get from MD. The training data is shown in purple. The testing data is shown in the gray circles. So, this is nice, but with 18 features, it doesn't really give us any insight. So we started removing features one by one, and we got down to a model with 4 features. They're listed up here. And now that's enough that you can sort of wrap your head around it. And so with that information, we thought, well, could we develop just simple heuristics, simple design rules that a synthetic chemist might use in thinking about designing MOFs that have faster diffusion for organophosphates? And this is what we came up with. Find MOFs with the largest node-to-node distance, and then sort them according to their surface area. So here's how it works. So here are our 776 diffusion coefficients just ranked from highest to lowest. That's the purple. So that's from MD. And then with this simple design heuristic, we would pick the ones that are in orange. So we're not predicting the value exactly. We're just telling the heuristic just says, well, these will be the MOFs with the fastest diffusion. And you can see the simple heuristic identifies 13 out of the top 20 performing MOFs in terms of fast diffusion. So it gave us some insight related to node to node distance and high surface area. Okay, so I've tried to give you a little introduction to molecular dynamics simulations for predicting diffusion in crystalline nanoporous materials, talked briefly about best practices for performing and reporting MD simulations, and showed you just a little bit of what you can do with these methods. So I'd like to thank collaborators. Brandon was involved with both the review article and the MOF work that I showed you. My co-authors on the adsorption review, Yerk for leading the IUPAC report. A lot of this work in my group was funded by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And so I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. We already have some questions coming in. So the first question is from Yu Feng, who is asking about if you could explain a bit why the RMSD is at least 1 unit cell length.
So the thought is, so let me clarify. So by roots mean square displacement, it's like on average, how far has each molecule moved? And this kind of rule of thumb is that on average, each molecule should have moved at least one unit cell. If it didn't, you could imagine it might just be sitting in one cavity and never actually going into other cavities. And so it's not really diffusing. It's not really moving very far. So it's just a rule of thumb. It's not a hard and fast requirement, but I think it's a useful metric.
Perfect.
Nicole.
Yes. Yeah. Let's move on with the questions. I think Yufeng, I think your question was answered. We have another question from Marcel, who's asking, when you have a periodic boundary conditions, how can you avoid that the fluid molecule interacts with its own replicate?
Oh, so there is actually, yeah, it's a good point. There is another kind of rule that people use, which is that the cutoff distance has to be less than half the box length. So if your box is, 20 angstroms or yeah, 20 angstroms, then your cutoff distance can't be longer than 10 angstroms, or particles would start interacting with their periodic images, which you do want to avoid because that would introduce an artificial periodicity. So that's known as the minimum image convention.
Okay, great. We have more questions coming in. I think we have some time for a couple more. So Jim is asking, given the intrinsic complexities associated with diffusion in new microporous materials, do you think the risk of arriving at an incorrect answer is shared equally between simulation and experiment?
Um, what was the beginning of the question again?
Yeah, let me repeat. So given the intrinsic complexities associated with diffusion in new microporous materials, so really looking at the new materials, if experiments and simulations share the risk, let's say, of a...
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think it's a very good question. I'll point out, for example, the limitations of what I described today. I described how to predict diffusion in a perfect MOF or zeolite, right? There are no defects. It's, there's no mesopores. It's perfectly crystalline, and we're looking at an infinite system. If you do pulse field gradient NMR or quasi-elastic neutron scattering, especially quasi-elastic neutron scattering, you're exploring the same length scales. PFG NMR actually explores somewhat longer length scales. So you can imagine if your zeolite has like some sort of grain boundary where diffusion is very slow, the PFG NMR is going to explore that and might report slower diffusivity than you would get from MD because your MD doesn't include that grain boundary. So yeah, you want to keep in mind the limitations of any of these techniques. The time scale they're exploring, the length scale, and yeah, sort of these intrinsic um, limitations, especially for models where you have a model, and that's what you're predicting the results for that model.
Great. We have more questions. So this one is from Chris Wilmer. He is asking, what are some strategies to help with slow diffusion? So when the timescales get to the diffusive regime and they are very computationally expensive.
Yeah, that's a great question. So MD has these inherent timescale limitations. So if we have a time step of 1 femtosecond, you can simulate um, microseconds at the most, usually maybe hundreds of picoseconds, nanoseconds. Um, but you might be interested in some diffusive event that occurs on much longer time scales. And one method people use is to invoke transition state theory. this basic picture that the molecules are diffusing by sitting in one low energy region, hopping over a barrier, and then going into another region. And you could imagine thinking of that as basically a diffusive hop, and that there will be a rate constant associated with that hop. And using transition state theory, you can take the same molecular model that we use in MD, estimate that hopping rate, and from that you can get a diffusion coefficient. It's not nearly as straightforward as doing MD, but it's one method of exploring these longer time scales.
Great, that's a really interesting question. We would have another one. You have introduced, mentioned that there are a lot of open source codes out there, and also talked about some codes written by Ernesto in your group. Do you have any other suggestions for codes where one could start with? They're doing their first MD simulation.
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on what you want to do. If you want to simulate some very complicated system, one of these kind of standard packages like LAMMPS or GROMACS or RASPA, I mean, these are, they have a lot of powerful methods in them, but they're big, complicated codes. If you're interested in simulating, a box full of argon and just sort of exploring and learning how the methods work, I don't know the details, but I'm sure you can go online and find simpler MD codes that, would be much shorter. They might not have all the fancy thermostats and other things in them, but they would be more easier to read and to really look at the details of what the code is doing. So yeah, it depends a little bit on what you want to do, but there are lots of resources online.
Great, thank you for that answer. We have another question. Do you still have time to take some?
Yes, I can take a few more questions.
Perfect. So we have one from Arthur Toshev, who's asking if whether you published the data set with the extracted MOF descriptors which you used in the machine learning study.
I think we did. It's been a couple of years. I don't remember exactly, but if we didn't, we should have. And we're definitely moving in that direction. And I think the field is moving in that direction of, yeah, if you generate some large data set, make it available, because then other people may be able to use it and build on it. And I, strongly recommend that that people do that.
Yeah, that's publishing data sets is always something we should strive for. So we have another question from Siu Yul Kim, who is impressed by how you distilled design principles from results. And so the question now is, how did you identify the candidate factors, and how might this extend to multiple interacting parameters?
Yeah, what we did, can I my screen has frozen. Oh, there we go. What we did is we started with the model that had the 18 parameters, and we started by we removed one. We have 18 parameters. Try removing each of them. See which one made the least difference, and then remove it. Retrain the model now with 17 parameters. Now again, you try removing all of them and find out, well, which one didn't really matter much. And so you just keep doing that. So this so-called recursive feature elimination, we kept doing that until we got down to 4. And when we got down to 4, now if you start removing parameters, the model gets a lot worse. And so we felt like 4 was the minimum to get a good prediction. And then in terms of the heuristic, I mean, then you start just sort of using some of your chemical intuition. And in some sense, in sometimes when you're doing this sort of research, running the MD simulation is the easy part. It's how do you analyze the results and think about them? That's what requires some thought. And so, yeah, that's, the thought went into getting these heuristics. But like I said, what we did was we got it down to 4 parameters. And then it's something that you can start to grasp with your mind. And we sort of boiled it down to these these heuristics that involve really just 2 parameters.
Amazing. One more question that we have is whether there are any particular MOF topologies or structures that are especially challenging to simulate accurately, and maybe why.
There are a couple of challenges. So one is if the pores are too small, the molecules just don't diffuse on the MD time scale. So you may have noticed in some of these graphs, there are points down here on the x-axis. And so what's going on here? These are structures where the mean square displacement was not long enough that we felt we could extract a reliable diffusion coefficient. So we just said they're lower than 10 to the minus 11. We don't know exactly what they are. So that's one issue, if diffusion is too slow. The other issue with these zirconium MOFs is having a good model for the interaction of these polar adsorbate molecules with OH groups and water molecules on the nodes. Those interactions are somewhat sensitive to the model and are something that we're continuing to look at.
Great. I think this was a good last question. Thank you very much, Dr. Randy Snurr, for your very insightful presentation. So Nick Wilkins will take back the screen to announce the next webinar. And thank you very much again from everyone.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Randy Snurr, for your presentation, Molecular Simulation of Diffusion in Nanoporous Materials, Basics, Best Practices, and Comparisons with Experiment. For our IAS webinar series, Diffusion in Nanoporous Materials, Guidelines for Measurement and Reporting, focusing on the recent IUPAC technical report titled Diffusion in Nanoporous Materials with a special consideration of the measurement of determining parameters. It is also linked in the description of this video. We thank all of our attendees for joining this webinar and hope it was both educational and enjoyable. An edited version of this webinar will be posted on the IAS YouTube channel and Bilibili. The hope is that the work discussed here today will be a useful resource for the adsorption science community in the future. The next confirmed IAS webinar will be given by Dr. Maria Papanathiou on October 1st at 1400 UTC. Announcements regarding the next webinar and other IAS online events will be posted on our Twitter feed, LinkedIn page, and through the IAS mailing list. With that, we thank you for joining us and hope that you'll join us again soon.